Thomas Harrison had dreamed of serving the royal family since he was a young boy. Growing up in a small village outside London, he would watch the changing of the guard on television with wide eyes, imagining himself in that famous red uniform and tall black hat. His father, a simple carpenter, would smile and ruffle his hair whenever Thomas declared he would one day protect the Queen. Years of hard work and dedication led Thomas to that very position. At 25, he stood proudly as one of the Queen's guards at Windsor Castle. The training had been grueling, but every moment of discipline and sacrifice felt worth it. When he first put on that iconic uniform, his parents had tears in their eyes when they saw him in his ceremonial dress, standing tall and proud. Thomas took his duties seriously. He understood that being a Queen's Guard meant more than just standing still for hours. He was a symbol of tradition, honor, and the unwavering dedication to the crown. Every morning, he would polish his boots until they gleamed, press his uniform until every crease was perfect, and prepare mentally for the day ahead. The castle grounds were magnificent, and Thomas never tired of the history that surrounded him. He had been stationed at various posts throughout the castle, but his favorite assignment was near the main entrance where visitors would gather to catch a glimpse of royal life. Children would often point at him excitedly, trying to make him smile or move. Thomas had mastered the art of remaining completely still, his face a mask of professional composure, but behind that stoic expression was a kind heart. Thomas genuinely loved seeing the joy on children's faces when they visited the castle. He remembered being that excited child himself, dreaming of fairy tales and royal adventures. Though he couldn't show it outwardly, their innocent wonder brought warmth to his heart during long hours of standing guard. The royal family members he had encountered were always gracious and respectful to the staff. The Queen herself had once nodded to him during her morning walk, a small gesture that filled him with pride for weeks. The younger royals, including the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, would often acknowledge the guards with subtle smiles or nods of appreciation. Prince George, the young heir to the throne, was particularly curious about the guards. Thomas had noticed the little prince watching them during family visits to Windsor. The child would peek around his parents' legs, studying the motionless figures in red with obvious fascination. Thomas found the prince's curiosity endearing, though he maintained his professional demeanor at all times. Life as a guard required significant personal sacrifice. Thomas had missed family gatherings, birthdays, and holidays. His social life was limited, and maintaining relationships outside the royal service proved challenging. But he believed deeply in the importance of his role. He was part of something bigger than himself, a tradition that had endured for centuries. The physical demands were considerable too. Standing perfectly still for hours in all weather conditions tested his endurance daily. His feet would ache, his back would stiffen, and his mind would sometimes wander to thoughts of a warm cup of tea or a comfortable chair. Yet he never wavered in his commitment. Each day he reminded himself of the oath he had taken and the trust placed in him. Thomas had served faithfully for 3 years, earning the respect of his fellow guards and superiors. His record was spotless, his dedication unwavering. He had become known among the staff for his reliability and quiet strength. Colleagues would often seek his advice on protocol, or simply enjoy his company during brief breaks. The changing seasons at Windsor brought different challenges and beauties. Spring brought crowds of tourists eager to see the famous guards and perhaps catch a glimpse of royalty. Summer meant longer days and intense heat under the heavy uniform. Autumn painted the castle grounds in brilliant colors that Thomas could glimpse from his peripheral vision. Winter tested his resolve with bitter cold and biting winds. Despite the challenges, Thomas found deep satisfaction in his service. He knew that his presence, along with his fellow guards, provided security and maintained the dignity of the royal residence. Tourists from around the world came to see them, and he took pride in representing British tradition and excellence. Every photograph taken, every admiring glance from visitors, reinforced his sense of purpose. Thomas's family had grown to understand and respect his dedication. His mother would send care packages with warm socks and his favorite biscuits. His father, initially worried about his son's chosen career, had become incredibly proud. During family gatherings, Thomas would share carefully chosen stories about his experiences, always mindful of his duty to maintain confidentiality about royal matters. The other guards had become like brothers to him. They shared the unique experience of serving the crown, understanding the pressures and privileges that came with their position. During their limited free time, they would gather to share meals, watch football, or simply enjoy normal conversation. These moments of camaraderie helped balance the formal nature of their daily duties. Thomas had learned to find small joys within the structure of his role. The sound of his boots on the ancient stones, the weight of his rifle, the feeling of the wind through the castle grounds. All these became familiar comforts. He had developed an almost meditative appreciation for the rhythm of his duties, finding peace in the repetition and routine. As winter approached in his 3rd year of service, Thomas felt settled in his role. He had grown from an eager young recruit into a seasoned guard, respected by his peers and trusted by his superiors. He looked forward to many more years of faithful service, never imagining that a simple gesture from a small prince would soon change the entire course of his life. The foundation had been laid for what would become an extraordinary story of human connection transcending the formal boundaries of royal protocol. December had arrived with an unusual warmth, though the morning air still carried the crisp bite of winter. Thomas stood at his assigned post near the castle's main courtyard, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. The Christmas season always brought extra visitors to Windsor Castle, and today promised to be particularly busy with a special royal engagement scheduled for the afternoon. Prince William and Catherine were expected to arrive, with their children for a family gathering with the Queen. Such occasions always heightened security measures and required the guards to be especially vigilant. Thomas had been chosen for this prominent posting because of his exemplary record and unwavering composure, even in potentially distracting situations. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed increased activity around the castle. Staff members moved with purposeful efficiency, preparing for the royal arrival. Florists carried arrangements of winter flowers, and caterers wheeled covered carts toward the main building. The familiar pre-event energy filled the air, though Thomas remained focused on his duties, his eyes scanning the grounds with practiced vigilance. Around midday, the sound of approaching vehicles signaled the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge with their children. Thomas could hear the gentle excitement of the staff and the distant sound of car doors closing. Protocol required him to remain at his post while maintaining awareness of the royal family's movements through his peripheral vision. Prince George, now 6 years old, had grown considerably since Thomas first observed him as a toddler. The young prince walked with more confidence now, though he still possessed that natural curiosity that marked children his age. Princess Charlotte followed close behind, chattering excitedly to her mother about something only she could see in the castle grounds. Little Prince Louis, barely walking steadily, held tightly to his father's hand. As the family made their way toward the main entrance, Prince George's attention was immediately drawn to Thomas. The boy had always shown fascination with the guards, but today something seemed different. Instead of his usual quick glances and shy hiding behind his parents, George stopped walking entirely and stared directly at Thomas with an intensity that was both innocent and profound. Thomas could sense the child's gaze, even while maintaining his forward focus. Years of training had taught him to be aware of everything in his environment without obviously looking. He could feel the weight of those young eyes studying him, perhaps trying to understand how someone could stand so perfectly still for so long. Prince William noticed his son's distraction and gently encouraged him to continue walking. "Come along, George. We don't want to keep great-grandmother waiting," he said kindly, but the young prince seemed reluctant to move. His fascination with the guard clearly captivating his imagination. Catherine knelt down to her son's level, following his gaze to understand what had captured his attention so completely. "That's one of Granny's guards, George. He's doing a very important job keeping everyone safe," she explained in that warm, patient tone she was known for using with her children. But George wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Something about Thomas had sparked a connection that transcended the usual adult explanations. The boy took a small step closer, still well within the bounds of appropriate protocol, but close enough that Thomas could sense his presence more acutely. The December sun had found a break in the clouds, casting a golden light across the courtyard. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Prince George, with the pure intuition that only children possess, seemed to recognize something in Thomas that others might miss. Perhaps it was the subtle signs of fatigue from long hours of standing, or maybe the almost imperceptible tension that came from maintaining perfect composure despite personal struggles. Unknown to the royal family and even his fellow guards, Thomas had been dealing with significant personal challenges. His father had been diagnosed with a serious illness just weeks earlier, and the medical bills were mounting beyond his family's modest means. Thomas had been working extra shifts and considering difficult decisions about his future in the Guard. The weight of these concerns had been carefully hidden behind his professional facade, but somehow this perceptive child seemed to sense his inner turmoil. Prince George looked back at his parents, then again at Thomas. In his young mind, he was formulating something that would soon touch hearts around the world. The innocence of childhood allowed him to see past the uniform and protocol to the human being beneath. What he was about to do would demonstrate wisdom far beyond his years. Prince William and Catherine exchanged glances, recognizing that their son was processing something important. They had learned to trust George's instincts, knowing that children often possessed insights that adults might overlook. Rather than hurrying him along, they decided to allow this moment to unfold naturally. The other guards nearby had also noticed the unusual interaction. While maintaining their positions, they were aware that something special was developing. Thomas himself could feel the change in atmosphere, though he couldn't yet comprehend what was about to happen. The castle grounds seemed to hold its breath as Prince George made his decision. The staff members who had paused to watch this gentle encounter sensed they were witnessing something remarkable. Even the winter birds seemed to quiet their singing, as if nature itself was preparing for a moment of profound human connection. Thomas continued to stand at perfect attention, his training keeping him focused on his duties even as he sensed the extraordinary nature of this encounter. Years of discipline had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing could have readied him for what Prince George was about to do. The young Prince's expression had shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a recognition of shared humanity that would soon manifest in the most touching gesture imaginable. Prince George reached into his small coat pocket and pulled out something that caught the winter sunlight. It was a simple chocolate coin wrapped in gold foil, part of the Christmas treats his mother had given him for the car journey. The 6-year-old held it carefully in his small palm, looking at it thoughtfully before glancing back up at Thomas. Without warning, Prince George stepped forward and gently placed the chocolate coin at Thomas's feet. The gesture was so pure, so unexpected, that it seemed to stop time itself. The young prince then stepped back, looked up at the guard's face with those earnest eyes, and did something that no one could have anticipated. He saluted. It wasn't the perfect military salute that Thomas and his colleagues had perfected through years of training. It was the awkward, endearing salute of a 6-year-old boy who was trying his best to show respect and recognition. George's small hand trembled slightly as he held it to his forehead, his serious expression showing just how important this moment was to him. The silence that followed was profound. Catherine's hand flew to her heart, and Thomas could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. Prince William stood motionless, clearly moved by his son's spontaneous act of kindness and respect. Even the staff members who had been watching from a distance seemed to pause in their activities, sensing they had witnessed something extraordinary. For Thomas, the world seemed to shift on its axis. In his 3 years of service, he had received formal recognition, official commendations, and respectful nods from senior royals. But nothing had prepared him for this moment of pure human connection. The simple gesture from this small boy touched something deep within his heart that he had kept carefully guarded. The protocol training that had become second nature suddenly felt less important than the overwhelming emotion welling up inside him. Thomas could feel his eyes beginning to water, though years of discipline kept his posture perfect and his face forward. But inside, his heart was breaking and healing simultaneously. Prince George lowered his hand from his salute and gave Thomas a small, shy smile. It was the smile of a child who had done something kind and knew it was right, even if he couldn't fully explain why. The innocence and purity of the gesture seemed to illuminate the entire courtyard with warmth that had nothing to do with the December sun. Catherine knelt down again and whispered something to her son, her voice thick with emotion. Whatever she said made Prince George nod seriously before he looked once more at Thomas. The connection between the guard and the young prince had created a bubble of understanding that transcended their different worlds. Prince William approached his wife and son, placing a gentle hand on George's shoulder. Father and son exchanged a look of understanding that spoke to the values being instilled in the future king. This wasn't just a moment of childhood kindness. It was a lesson in humanity, compassion, and the recognition of service that would shape Prince George's character for years to come. Thomas remained at perfect attention, but every fiber of his being was focused on the small chocolate coin at his feet, and the memory of that imperfect, perfect salute. The gold foil caught the light occasionally, serving as a tangible reminder that this extraordinary moment had really happened. Other guards had noticed the exchange, and word began to spread quietly through the castle staff. Stories like this didn't happen often, and when they did, they became part of the living history of the place. The staff members who witnessed it would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. As the royal family finally continued their walk toward the main entrance, Prince George looked back several times at Thomas. Each glance carried the weight of their shared moment, a connection that had formed without words but with perfect understanding. The little prince seemed to sense that his gesture had meant something important, though he was too young to fully comprehend its significance. Catherine was overheard saying softly to her husband, "He sees people, doesn't he? Really sees them." Prince William nodded, his own emotions clearly stirred by his son's demonstration of empathy and kindness. They had always tried to teach their children about service and consideration for others, but watching George act on these lessons so naturally filled them with profound pride. The chocolate coin remained at Thomas's feet throughout the rest of his shift. He couldn't bend to pick it up, couldn't acknowledge its presence, but its mere existence there served as a constant reminder of what had just occurred. Fellow guards passing by noticed it too, and gradually the story of Prince George's gesture began to spread through the ranks. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself reflecting on what the moment had meant to him personally. The young prince's instinctive recognition of his humanity had touched wounds that Thomas hadn't even realized were there. The isolation that came with his position, the sacrifice of personal connections, the weight of always being on duty, all of these burdens had been acknowledged by a 6-year-old's simple act of kindness. When his shift finally ended, Thomas carefully picked up the chocolate coin. As he held it in his hand, the same hand that gripped his rifle day after day, he realized that something fundamental had changed within him. The gesture had awakened feelings and thoughts that he had suppressed in service of his duty. That evening, as Thomas walked through the castle corridors toward the guards' quarters, colleagues approached him with expressions of warmth and curiosity. Word of the encounter had spread, and everyone wanted to hear about the moment firsthand. But Thomas found himself struggling to put the experience into words. How could he explain that a child's simple gesture had made him question everything he thought he knew about service, duty, and human connection? How could he describe the way his heart had both broken and healed in the span of those few extraordinary minutes? The chocolate coin sat on his bedside table that night, still wrapped in its gold foil. Thomas stared at it for a long time before finally falling asleep, knowing that his life had been forever changed by a 6-year-old prince who had seen past the uniform to the man beneath. The next morning brought an unusual atmosphere to the guards' quarters. Thomas's fellow guards greeted him with knowing smiles and respectful nods, acknowledging that something special had happened. The story of Prince George's gesture had spread through the castle overnight, becoming part of the living tapestry of Windsor's daily life. Sergeant Major Davies, a stern man with 30 years of service, approached Thomas during the morning briefing. His weathered face carried an expression that Thomas had rarely seen, a mixture of professional respect and genuine warmth. "Harrison," he said quietly, "yesterday was something special. The boy showed wisdom beyond his years, and you handled it with perfect dignity." Thomas felt a flush of pride mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify. The recognition from his superior meant a great deal, but it also highlighted how the encounter had affected him more deeply than he initially realized. Throughout the briefing, he found his mind wandering back to Prince George's serious expression and that awkward, heartfelt salute. As Thomas took his position for the day, he noticed subtle changes in how visitors approached his post. Word had somehow leaked beyond the castle walls, as it often did when something truly remarkable occurred. Parents with children seemed more respectful, taking a moment to explain to their young ones about the guard's important job, rather than simply treating him as a living statue for photographs. A little girl, perhaps 7 years old, tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something while pointing at Thomas. The mother smiled and nodded, then approached respectfully. "My daughter wanted you to know," she said softly, "that she thinks you're very brave for standing so still and keeping everyone safe." Thomas couldn't respond, but the woman seemed to understand, giving a small nod before leading her daughter away. These small interactions began to accumulate throughout the morning. The elderly gentleman paused to offer a subtle salute of his own. A group of school children drew pictures of guards during their visit, and their teacher quietly placed one of the drawings near Thomas's post before moving on. Each gesture was small, but together they created a pattern of recognition and respect that felt different from the usual tourist curiosity. During his brief lunch break, Thomas was approached by Margaret, one of the castle's senior housekeeping staff. She was a motherly woman who had worked at Windsor for 20 years and knew everything that happened within its walls. "That was beautiful what happened yesterday," she said, setting down a cup of tea beside him. "Prince George has always been a special child, but that gesture, it showed real heart." Margaret sat down across from him, her kind eyes studying his face. "You know, Thomas, in all my years here, I've seen many touching moments between the royal family and staff. But there was something about yesterday that felt different. The way that little prince looked at you. It was like he really saw you, not just the uniform." Thomas nodded, still struggling to process his emotions about the encounter. "I keep thinking about it," he admitted. "It was such a simple thing, but somehow it felt significant." "It was significant," Margaret assured him. "Sometimes children can see things we adults miss. They look past the surface to what really matters. Prince George saw someone who needed a moment of kindness, and he gave it without hesitation." That afternoon, Thomas received an unexpected summons to report to the lieutenant colonel's office. As he walked through the corridors, his mind raced with possibilities. Had he somehow violated protocol? Was there fallout from the incident that he hadn't anticipated? Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton was a decorated officer with an impressive bearing and a reputation for fairness. As Thomas entered his office, he was surprised to see a warm smile on the usually serious man's face. "Please sit down, Harrison," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I wanted to speak with you about yesterday's incident," the lieutenant colonel began. "First, let me assure you that you handled the situation perfectly. Your composure and professionalism were exemplary." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "But I'm more interested in how the experience affected you personally." Thomas was taken aback by the question. In all his years of service, no superior had ever asked about his personal feelings regarding his duties. "It was moving, sir. Unexpected. The young prince's gesture was very kind." Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Thomas, I've been in the military for 30 years and I've served the crown in various capacities. In that time, I've learned that moments like yesterday are rare and precious. They remind us why we serve, not just for duty or tradition, but for the human connections that make our service meaningful." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the castle grounds. "I've received word that the Duke and Duchess were deeply moved by their son's actions. They wanted to ensure that your professionalism was recognized." He turned back to Thomas with a slight smile. "But more importantly, they wanted to make sure you knew that Prince George spoke about you all evening. He told them he thought you looked like you needed a friend." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. The simple wisdom of a 6-year-old had seen through years of careful emotional armor to recognize his loneliness and burden. Tears welled up in his eyes before he could stop them. "There's no shame in being moved by kindness, Harrison," the lieutenant colonel said gently. "In fact, it shows you haven't lost your humanity in service of your duty. That's a balance many struggle to maintain." As Thomas walked back to his quarters that evening, he reflected on the lieutenant colonel's words. The encounter with Prince George had indeed reminded him of his own humanity, but it had also raised questions about his future that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. That night, he called his parents for the first time in weeks. When his mother answered, her voice filled with warmth and concern, Thomas found himself telling them about Prince George's gesture. His father, still battling his illness but ever practical, listened quietly before saying, "Sounds like that little boy has good instincts about people. Maybe you should trust his judgment about yourself." As Thomas prepared for bed, he looked again at the chocolate coin on his bedside table. The simple gift had become a symbol of something much larger. a reminder that beneath the uniform, the protocol, and the duty, he was still a person deserving of kindness and human connection. The ripple effects of Prince George's gesture were spreading far beyond what anyone could have anticipated, touching hearts and changing perspectives throughout Windsor Castle and beyond. In the weeks following Prince George's gesture, Thomas found himself experiencing a profound internal shift. The simple act of kindness had awakened something within him that he had buried deep beneath years of disciplined service. Sleep became elusive as he wrestled with questions about his future, his purpose, and what truly mattered in life. His father's condition had worsened, requiring more intensive treatment that the family could barely afford. Thomas had been sending most of his salary home, but it still wasn't enough. The stress of watching his father suffer while being unable to provide adequate help had been eating away at him for months. Prince George's intuitive recognition of his pain had somehow made the burden both more bearable and more difficult to ignore. The chocolate coin remained on his bedside table, a constant reminder of that moment of pure human connection. Sometimes Thomas would hold it, turning the gold foil over in his fingers while contemplating the crossroads he now faced. The gesture had shown him that his humanity was still intact, but it had also highlighted how much he had sacrificed in service of duty and tradition. Margaret, the housekeeper who had become an unexpected confidant, noticed the change in Thomas during their brief encounters. One evening, as he walked past the staff kitchen, she called out to him, "You look troubled, dear. Come, sit with an old lady for a moment." Thomas found himself accepting her invitation, something he might not have done before Prince George's gesture opened his heart. Margaret poured 2 cups of tea and settled across from him with the patient demeanor of someone who had listened to countless troubles over the years. "Talk to me," she said simply. Sometimes saying things out loud helps us see them more clearly. Thomas hesitated, then found himself opening up about his father's illness, the financial strain, and the impossible choice he was beginning to face. Margaret listened without judgment, occasionally nodding with understanding that came from her own experiences with family struggles. "The thing is," Thomas concluded, "I love serving here. It's been my dream since childhood. But Prince George's kindness made me realize that I've been so focused on duty that I've forgotten about the people I love most." Margaret reached across the table and patted his hand gently. "Thomas, that little prince didn't just give you a chocolate coin. He gave you permission to be human again. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is to the people who love us most." The next few days brought an unexpected development. Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton summoned Thomas to his office once again, but this time the meeting felt different from the start. The officer's expression was serious, and there were papers on his desk that hadn't been there during their previous conversation. "Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," the lieutenant colonel began. "Are you facing any personal difficulties that might be affecting your service?" Thomas felt his heart race. Had his internal struggles become visible despite his efforts to maintain professionalism? He took a deep breath and made a decision to trust his superior's apparent concern. "Yes, sir. My father is seriously ill, and the medical expenses are beyond our family's means. I've been trying to help financially, but—" His voice trailed off, unsure how much to reveal. The lieutenant colonel nodded thoughtfully. "I suspected as much. Your performance hasn't suffered. You're still exemplary in your duties. But there's been a quality to your attention lately that suggests your mind is elsewhere during off-duty hours." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more personal than official. "Thomas, the Crown values service, but not at the expense of destroying the lives of those who serve. There are resources available, support systems that many don't know about." The lieutenant colonel explained various assistance programs available to guards and their families, including emergency medical funds and compassionate leave options. Thomas listened with growing amazement, realizing that help had been available all along if he had only asked. "However," the officer continued, "I sense that your situation goes deeper than immediate financial concerns. Am I correct in thinking that you're questioning your future with the Guard?" The directness of the question caught Thomas off guard. He had been so careful to maintain his professional facade, yet somehow his inner turmoil was visible to those who knew how to look. "I'm conflicted, sir," Thomas admitted. "This has been my dream for so long, but recent events have made me realize how much I've given up. My father might not have much time left, and I've missed so much of his life already." The lieutenant colonel was quiet for several minutes, appearing to weigh his words carefully. Thomas, let me share something with you that I learned many years ago. True service sometimes means knowing when to step away. The Guard will always need dedicated people, but families can't be replaced. He stood and walked to a bookshelf, retrieving a small framed photograph. "This is my son," he said, showing Thomas the picture. "I missed his childhood in service of my career. He's a fine man now, but will never have those years back. I don't regret my service, but I do regret not finding better balance." The conversation continued for another hour, with the lieutenant colonel sharing his own experiences and offering guidance about the difficult choice Thomas faced. As the meeting concluded, he handed Thomas a packet of information about the support programs and made a suggestion that surprised him. "Take some leave, Thomas. Go home, spend time with your father, and think about what you truly want. The Guard isn't going anywhere, and neither is your exemplary record, but make your decision with full information about your options." That evening, Thomas called his parents with news of the available medical assistance and his upcoming leave. His mother's tears of relief were audible through the phone, and his father's voice, though weak, carried a note of hope that had been missing for weeks. As Thomas packed a small bag for his journey home, he carefully wrapped Prince George's chocolate coin and placed it in his pocket. The simple gift had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of the moment when a 6-year-old prince had seen his pain and responded with pure kindness. The train journey home gave Thomas time to reflect on the path that had led him to this crossroads. Prince George's gesture had been the catalyst, but the questions it raised had been building for months. The young prince's ability to see beyond the uniform to the person beneath had forced Thomas to examine what he truly valued in life. As familiar countryside rolled past the train window, Thomas realized that whatever decision he made about his future, it would be informed by the wisdom of a child who had understood, better than many adults, the importance of human connection and compassion. The 2 weeks Thomas spent at home transformed his understanding of what honor truly meant. Watching his father receive proper medical treatment, funded by the Crown's assistance program, filled him with gratitude he had never expected to feel. But more importantly, being able to hold his father's hand during difficult days and share quiet conversations about life, dreams and regrets taught him that service came in many forms. His father, a man who had always valued duty and hard work, surprised Thomas with his perspective on the situation. "Son," he said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, "I've been proud of you every day since you put on that uniform. But I'm prouder still that you're here now, when your family needs you most." During those precious days at home, Thomas wrestled with his decision. The honor of serving the Crown had been his guiding principle for years, but Prince George's simple gesture had shown him that honor could also be found in recognizing when personal sacrifice had reached its limit. The chocolate coin in his pocket served as a daily reminder of the moment when a child's wisdom had changed his entire perspective. Thomas's mother, ever practical, helped him explore his options. Together, they researched career paths that would allow him to serve his community while remaining close to family. Teaching appealed to him particularly, especially working with children who reminded him of the innocent wisdom Prince George had displayed. When Thomas returned to Windsor Castle, he felt a sense of peace about his decision. The familiar sight of the ancient walls and the sound of his boots on the stone pathways filled him with nostalgia rather than regret. This place had shaped him, taught him discipline and dedication, and given him memories he would treasure forever. Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton received him warmly, immediately asking about his father's condition and how the leave had affected his thinking. Thomas appreciated the officer's genuine concern, which had become more apparent since their honest conversations began. "I've made my decision, sir," Thomas said, standing at attention in the familiar office. "I would like to request an honorable discharge from the Queen's Guard. My family needs me now, and I've come to understand that serving them is also a form of service to the Crown." The lieutenant colonel nodded with understanding rather than disappointment. "I thought that might be your choice, and I respect it completely. You've served with distinction, Thomas, and you're leaving for the right reasons." The paperwork and transition process took several weeks, during which Thomas continued his duties with the same dedication he had always shown. His fellow guards, aware of his decision, treated him with increased respect rather than disappointment. Many shared their own struggles with balancing service and personal life. and several admitted they admired his courage to choose family when the decision became necessary. Word of Thomas's departure eventually reached the royal family through the natural channels of castle communication. What happened next surprised everyone involved. Prince William requested a private moment with Thomas before his final day of service, a gesture that was highly unusual but perfectly in character for the thoughtful future king. The meeting took place in a small sitting room within the castle, informal and warm rather than ceremonial. Prince William entered with a smile that put Thomas immediately at ease, despite the significance of the moment. "Thomas," the prince said, extending his hand in greeting, "I wanted to thank you personally for your service and to tell you how moved Catherine and I were by your interaction with George." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the personal nature of the encounter. "Your Royal Highness, it was Prince George who showed kindness to me. His gesture it changed my life." Prince William's expression grew thoughtful. "George spoke about you for days after that encounter. He said he thought you looked sad and needed a friend. Children see things we adults often miss, don't they?" The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Prince William expressing genuine interest in Thomas's plans and offering encouragement for his future endeavors. As their meeting concluded, the prince handed Thomas a small envelope. "This is from George," he explained. "He drew it himself when he heard you were leaving. He wanted to make sure you received it." Thomas opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a child's drawing of a guard and a small prince standing together, with a chocolate coin between them drawn in careful crayon circles. At the bottom, in Prince George's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being brave. Your friend, Prince George." The impact of the drawing was immediate and profound. Thomas felt tears forming in his eyes as he looked at the innocent artwork that captured the essence of their connection. The guard in the drawing was smiling, something the real Thomas had never been able to do while on duty, but which represented how the encounter had made him feel inside. Prince William watched Thomas's reaction with obvious warmth. "George wanted you to know that he understands why you're leaving, and he thinks you're making the right choice. He said anyone who loves their family that much must be a very good person." On his final day of service, Thomas stood one last time at the post where Prince George had changed his life. His replacement, a young guard named David, who reminded Thomas of himself 3 years earlier, stood nearby learning the rhythms and responsibilities of the position. As Thomas prepared to leave the castle grounds for the final time, he was surprised to see a small crowd of staff members who had gathered to see him off. Margaret, the housekeeper, was there, along with several fellow guards, kitchen staff, and even some of the groundskeepers. Their presence demonstrated that his service had been valued, and that his departure was felt throughout the castle community. The formal ceremony of returning his uniform and equipment was dignified and respectful. Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton presented him with a letter of commendation that highlighted his exemplary service and noted that he was leaving to honor family obligations with the same dedication he showed to the crown. As Thomas walked through the castle gates for the last time, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a small bag containing his personal belongings and Prince George's drawing, he felt a profound sense of completion. His service to the crown had ended with honor, but his life's service was just beginning. 6 months later, Thomas was teaching history and citizenship at a primary school near his family home. His father's health had stabilized with proper treatment, and Thomas found joy in sharing stories of service, duty, and honor with children who listened with wide eyes reminiscent of Prince George's attention. The chocolate coin and drawing held places of honor in his classroom, serving as reminders that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the smallest voices. When his students asked about them, Thomas would tell them about a little prince who taught him that true courage sometimes meant knowing when to change direction, and that the highest honor came from serving those we love most. Prince George's gesture had indeed touched every heart it reached, creating ripples of kindness and understanding that extended far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. Thomas's story became part of the living history of royal service, demonstrating that sometimes the most significant moments come not from grand ceremonies or official recognition, but from the simple, pure gestures of a child who saw a fellow human being in need of kindness.